Welcome to the morning. The earth itself began to move when German soldiers blinked through the fog and realized the ground was alive and coming for them. September 15th, 1916. Flers-Courcelette, northern France. A field already torn apart by months of shells and rain. Black smoke, yellow gas. The moan of wounded men rising from the trenches like the last breath of a dying world. Out of that ruin came a sound none of them had ever heard before. A grinding metallic growl, steady, monstrous, unnatural. They fired rifles. The bullets sparked and died. They shouted for machine guns. The guns chattered, and the monster kept moving. It didn't flinch, it didn't bleed, it didn't stop. 40 tons of riveted steel crawling on endless tracks, spitting smoke, dragging the weight of a new age behind it. The first tank in human history, the Mark I. Britain's impossible invention crawling straight into the heart of the Great War. Imagine you're there in a trench filled with mud gas and fear when the impossible happens. A shape you can't name pushes through the barbed wire. Its armor plates slick with rain and blood, its cannon blinking through the haze like a single cold eye. Men scream, "It's a monster." Others think it's a trick, a weapon of the devil. For centuries, wars had been fought by men, horses, and courage. But that morning, courage met machinery, and courage lost. The first time mankind built something that could move and kill on its own without needing breath or mercy. The Germans called it the Teufelwagen, the devil's wagon. British engineers called it a land ship. History would call it the beginning of mechanized war, the day humanity discovered that steel could break stalemate. The tank didn't roar into battle like a charge of cavalry. It groaned, it shook it, crawled, crushing trenches like bones under its tracks. Inside, the crew suffocated in heat and fumes, shouting over the noise of the engine, half blind, half mad. Yet it worked. The German line shattered not because of its firepower, but because of fear, raw, primal fear, the kind that breaks even the strongest soldier when he faces something beyond reason. Some Germans fled before the tank fired a shot. Others emptied entire belts of ammo at its steel hide and watched bullets flatten like raindrops on armor. This was no legend. It was filmed, photographed, documented in every British report from the Somme. The War Office recorded, the machine advanced unimpeded through heavy fire, crushing enemy wire and trenches with satisfactory effect. But no document could capture the madness of that morning, the mixture of awe and terror that swept across both sides. Because this wasn't just another weapon, it was evolution, steel replacing flesh, invention replacing desperation. The fog rolled low, the sound deepened. The tank reached the lip of the German trench, the ground broke under its weight, and it slid forward, crushing sandbags, timber, and bone. British infantry followed behind their boots, sinking into the churned earth. For the first time since 1914, men saw open ground beyond the wire. The tank didn't just move, it led. It carried them out of fear and into possibility. And in that moment, even as the smell of oil and cordite filled the air, every soldier watching knew the age of the horse was over. But the cost was chaos. Inside those steel beasts, men were choking, burning, bleeding from the roar of their own machine. The first crews of the Mark I were pioneers, engineers, turned soldiers locked inside a furnace. They called it driving hell in a box. Temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Fumes filled their lungs. The noise shattered eardrums. But they kept going because failure meant the death of everything they'd built. And outside in the trenches, men watched in disbelief, as if the ground had finally rebelled against war itself. That morning, the Mark I rolled forward not just through mud, but through time itself. It crushed more than trenches. It crushed an entire century of military logic. The Germans thought their lines were impregnable trenches, machine guns, barbed wire, artillery, all working together in a deadly equation of stalemate. But the Mark I was the variable no one had calculated. It was not faster than a bullet, not smarter than a man, but it was untouchable, unstoppable, unimaginable. A weapon so alien it changed how humans thought about war in a single morning. By nightfall, the battlefield looked different. Not just because of victory or defeat, but because of what had appeared there. The machine stayed half-buried, smoking its steel skin dented by thousands of bullets. The Germans studied it in silence. The British photographed it like a newborn. And somewhere in London, generals whispered what no one dared say aloud: "If we can build one, we can build 1,000. And from that whisper, an empire of steel began to grow. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Imagine standing in that trench, hearing that grinding sound for the first time. Would you have fired, or would you have frozen? Share what you felt in that moment, because today we're stepping into the fog of 1916, when Britain's Mark I shattered the trenches and the world changed forever. September 1916. The Somme had already become a graveyard without crosses. For 79 days straight, artillery had turned the French countryside into an open wound. The land itself no longer remembered what it once was. Fields of wheat and poppies had been ground into sludge, and wire rivers of men poured into the trenches and vanished without names. Each morning began with the same thunder, heavy guns from Thiepval to Guillemont, British shells screaming across a horizon that never seemed to move. And yet, despite millions of shells, the line barely shifted more than a few hundred yards. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped in a war of inches won, where courage meant nothing against machine guns and mathematics. Generals called it industrial slaughter. The soldiers just called it hell. In London, the headlines spoke of progress of a new push along the Somme, of the enemy weakening. But inside the mud, no one believed in victory anymore. Men wrote letters home that smelled of damp wool and hopelessness. They described trenches filled with water, waist-deep rats as large as cats, the air so thick with cordite it felt like breathing smoke. Every few yards the dead formed part of the walls themselves, frozen into the parapet, staring up through layers of clay and despair. When it rained, the earth swallowed them whole. When it stopped, the stench rose like a ghost that never left. The German lines stood opposite mirror images of misery. From both sides the same cries echoed for food, for sleep, for release. The Great War had begun with flags and bugles, but by 1916 it had dissolved into something mechanical, impersonal, and eternal. Machine guns scythed through battalions faster than generals could write their names. At Verdun, men had fought over the same hill 20 times. At the Somme, one division of the British Army lost 57,000 men in a single day. It was no longer about territory or glory, it was arithmetic. Every advance demanded more bodies. Every breakthrough collapsed under its own blood. The logic of war had frozen solid, and both sides knew it. In this stalemate, new ideas began to stir in the minds of desperate men. In workshops far from the front, engineers whispered of something unthinkable. A moving fortress, a landship that could cross the trenches, crush the wire, and carry men across no man's land alive. The notion sounded absurd. Officers laughed. Politicians rolled their eyes. But deep inside the Admiralty, in a small office hidden under Naval Command, a handful of men led by Winston Churchill took the idea seriously. They called themselves the Landships Committee. Their experiment was secret even from most of the army. They worked under the cover of night in barns and factories, testing steel plates and tractor engines, searching for a way to turn the impossible into movement. Back on the front, the men had no idea what was coming. They dug and died under the same sky, believing nothing could break the machine of death that surrounded them. The German defenses were masterpieces of engineering: trenches 3 lines deep, concrete bunkers, belts of barbed wire thick as hedges. They had machine guns every 30 yards, overlapping arcs of fire that made any assault suicidal. British generals kept ordering frontal attacks, and every time the whistles blew, the men went over the top only to vanish in clouds of dust and shrapnel. Some units lost every officer before reaching halfway. Others simply lay down and waited for night to hide them. It was a war fought by ghosts before the ghosts were even dead. Then came a rumor something new was being built in England, something that moved without horses, something that could roll through the trenches. The soldiers joked about it. They said it was a mechanical elephant or a ship that sails on mud. No one believed it would work. Machines broke too easily. Mud ate everything. The Somme was no place for miracles. But inside the factories of Lincoln, a team of inventors led by William Tritton and Walter Wilson was proving them wrong. Using the chassis of a Holt tractor and plates of naval armor, they forged the first prototype, a rhomboid beast with tracks that looped around its entire body, designed to climb out of shell holes and crawl over trenches. It had a 105 horsepower engine and carried 2 6-pounder guns. It looked primitive, ugly, absurd. But when it moved, it made the earth shake. They called it Mother. By early September, 32 of her offspring had been shipped across the Channel under absolute secrecy. Each was disguised under the label water tank for Mesopotamia, hence the name that would stay forever, tank. The soldiers unloading them at the docks had no idea what they were. To them, it was another box of British bureaucracy. But in the minds of a few visionaries, it was the key to breaking the deadlock. The plan was simple: use the new machines to punch holes in the German line, then send infantry through before the enemy could react. Simple, but nothing in the Somme was ever simple. The night before the attack, the tanks gathered near Flers. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground soft and treacherous. Engines coughed in the dark like beasts waking from slumber. Mechanics worked by candlelight, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, praying the engines wouldn't seize. Many of the crew were volunteers, men from engineering units, or even from civilian workshops barely trained for combat. They had been told to expect heavy fire, thick mud, and confusion, but none of them really knew what that meant until they saw the battlefield at dawn. Through the mist, the horizon looked like the surface of another planet. Blackened trees like bones craters, filled with green water, the smell of death thick enough to taste. The Germans on the opposite ridge waited with quiet confidence. They had repelled every British assault for months. Their intelligence reports mentioned nothing unusual. Their officers trusted the same old formula wire guns discipline. They did not know that beyond the fog, behind a curtain of creeping artillery fire, machines unlike anything they had ever seen were lining up. The British called them male and female tanks, the males armed with cannons, the females with machine guns. Each crew sealed themselves inside, locking the hatches like sailors preparing for a storm. Inside it was pitch dark. The air smelled of oil and sweat. The roar of the engine drowned out thought itself. At 6:20 a.m., the British artillery began to roll forward, the signal for the attack. The tanks lumbered into motion, engines straining, treads biting the mud. To the infantry following behind, it looked like giants rising from the earth. The plan was fragile. If one tank broke down, the others would be stranded. If they reached the enemy, no one knew how the Germans would react. But in that moment, every man watching felt something rare: anticipation instead of dread. For the first time in years, they believed in surprise. Across the lines, German observers stared through binoculars, confused by the shapes moving in the smoke. Some thought they were armored cars. Others thought it was artillery being dragged forward. Then, as the fog cleared, they saw the truth. These things were crawling alive, crushing everything beneath them. The machine guns opened up. Bullets sparked off armor. The monsters kept advancing. Panic spread through the first trench lines. Officers shouted, but the words vanished in chaos. The trenches that had once felt like fortresses now became traps. That morning, the Somme became a laboratory of fear. Every soldier, British or German, was witnessing the birth of a new law of war. The British command didn't know it yet, but half the tanks would break down before reaching the front. Some sank, some burned, some vanished in craters. But the ones that made it shattered something deeper than defenses. They shattered the certainty that men and trenches could stop progress. The noise of those engines was more than metal, it was prophecy. By nightfall, only a handful of tanks were still moving. But the psychological line had been broken. Across the front, messages crackled through, German telegraphs describing iron houses, land cruisers, armored beasts. Soldiers wrote home asking if the British had summoned machines from the future. For the first time since 1914, the war had shifted, not by territory, but by imagination. And from imagination would come the future, one filled with steel tracks and the hum of engines that would never again be silent. The Somme, once just a name for a river, had become the birthplace of the machine age. The Mark I was no miracle, no guarantee of victory. But it was a sign that human ingenuity, even in the darkest mud, could create something both terrifying and magnificent. And as dusk fell over the wreckage of Flers, amid the burning oil and twisted wire, every survivor on that field knew the same truth. The world of old war had died that morning, and something new had taken its place. In the days that followed the attack at Flers-Courcelette, reports began to surface, cold, factual, stripped of emotion, yet trembling with disbelief between the lines. The War Office summaries read like mechanical poetry. Machine advanced over obstacles with satisfactory performance. Enemy positions neutralized with minimal delay. Moral effect significant. Behind those bland sentences was a truth more explosive than any shell. The British had done the impossible. They had introduced a weapon that ignored every law of the battlefield. Until that moment, the First World War had been defined by geometry lines, trenches, ranges, arcs of fire. The Mark I ignored them all. It climbed over angles that defied physics, crossed ditches wider than its own body, and shattered the idea that defense could ever again be absolute. The data was astonishing. Each tank measured 26 feet long, 8 feet high, and weighed nearly 30 tons. Powered by a 105-horsepower Daimler engine, it moved at barely 4 miles per hour, slower than a walking man, yet unstoppable over mud wire and corpses. The hull was made of half-inch steel plates riveted by hand, and its two 6-pounder guns could fire shells capable of smashing through concrete bunkers. It required a crew of 8 commander-driver-gearsman gunners, loaders, and a mechanic to fight the machine itself as much as the enemy. The noise inside reached 120 decibels. The temperature rose past 130 Fahrenheit. Carbon monoxide thickened until men fainted at their posts. Yet when those steel boxes rolled forward, they changed every equation of the war. German observers recorded the effect in stark terms. Enemy introduced armored vehicles of unknown type. Infantry panicked. Defensive positions untenable. It was the first time in modern history that an army had retreated not from physical destruction, but from psychological collapse. The Germans didn't yet know what to call the new weapon. Some used Panzerwagen, others Kampfmaschine. Commanders in Berlin dismissed early reports as exaggeration until prisoners confirmed what they had seen with trembling voices. One German officer described it simply: it was as if the British had brought the Industrial Revolution itself to the battlefield. The British General Headquarters in France kept their own records meticulous. 29 tanks had been deployed. 9 never reached the front due to mechanical failure. 9 more bogged down or broke tracks before contact. 11 made it through. Of those, only 6 remained operational by evening. And yet, despite the failures, the tactical shock was immense. For the first time since 1914, the British had advanced more than a mile into enemy territory in a single day. They captured flares, seized hundreds of prisoners, and forced German units to fall back in confusion. The tank had not yet become a decisive weapon, but it had become an idea, and ideas move faster than machines. In London, military analysts debated what they had witnessed. Some saw a miracle of engineering. Others called it a fluke, a curiosity that would soon vanish under heavier artillery. But a few visionaries, men like Ernest Swinton, the officer who had first proposed the concept, understood the magnitude. He wrote, "The tank has revealed a truth about warfare, that mobility is the soul of survival." His memo was buried in bureaucracy, yet his words would echo through the next century. Factories began to hum. The British government commissioned hundreds more tanks even before the first battle reports were complete. Designs were modified, armor reinforced, engines improved, steering mechanisms refined. Within months, the Mark II and Mark III were already in production. The war that had once consumed flesh was now consuming metal. By 1917, the industrial machine of Britain was no longer just producing shells, it was producing movement itself. But numbers alone couldn't tell the full story. The Mark I was a paradox, a marvel of modernity that behaved like a beast of burden. Each tank required 78 man-hours of assembly, nearly 800 rivets, and 16 gallons of oil for every 10 miles of movement. It was fragile and indomitable all at once. Engineers called it an armored contradiction. The mechanical data was clear, but its human data was blood. Of the first crews who took those machines into battle, nearly half were killed or wounded not by enemy fire but by the machine itself. Carbon monoxide poisoning, heat exhaustion, crushed limbs between gears. The Mark I demanded sacrifice equal to its success. Inside the steel hull, the world was reduced to chaos and vibration. Reports from the crews spoke of unbearable noise, the roar of the engine, the hammering of the guns, the metallic scream of the tracks. Communication was almost impossible. Men shouted until their voices vanished. In one tank, the commander wrote in his log, "I could not see the enemy, nor the sky. Only the color of steel and the smell of burning." When a shell struck the armor, the rivets flew inward like bullets slicing flesh from bone. The men learned to tape their helmets and pad the walls with sacks of sand. But even then, every mission was a gamble against death from within. The War Office data that seemed so precise hid these truths. They measured distance, not despair, success, not suffering. Yet without those crews, without their willingness to endure the impossible, the machine would have remained a sketch on paper. Every tank that moved that day was driven by hands, blistered raw eyes burning from fumes, hearts beating faster than pistons. They were mechanics, not warriors, and yet they became the first armored soldiers of history. The Germans, too, began to analyze. Within weeks, captured tanks were shipped to Berlin for study. Engineers examined the armor, the treads, the gearing. Their reports concluded that the design was primitive, its engine underpowered, its armor vulnerable to artillery. But even as they dismissed it, they felt the chill of inevitability. General Ludendorff himself noted privately, If this concept is improved, the balance of war may be lost. That admission marked a turning point. For the first time, Germany realized that its mastery of defense could be undone not by bravery, but by invention. The statistics continued to accumulate. The Mark I's maximum speed was 3.6 miles per hour on firm ground, 2.5 in mud. It could cross a trench 8 feet wide and climb an obstacle 4 feet high. Its turning radius was 30 feet. Each gun had a range of 500 yards. These were the cold measurements of an age that believed numbers could explain everything, yet none could measure what had truly happened on that battlefield. For the men who saw it, the tank was not a vehicle. It was a revelation. The folklore layer began the same day. Soldiers wrote home describing giant coffins of steel moving fortresses and the roar of the earth awakening. Newspapers seized upon it, transforming the mechanical monster into myth. Civilians in Britain imagined these tanks as invincible juggernauts storming through German cities, ending the war overnight. Children played games called tank chase in the streets of London. But on the front, reality was harsher. Most of the machines that day lay silent by nightfall, broken in the mud. The miracle had limped rather than sprinted. Still, the myth mattered. Myths are what turn prototypes into revolutions. The British High Command began drafting new doctrines. Reports outlined the need for coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery, the beginnings of what future generations would call combined arms warfare. The Mark I had done more than fight. It had rewritten strategy. In the halls of the War Office, one memo warned, "Those who do not adapt to mechanized warfare will perish before they comprehend its form." It was prophetic. Numbers told one story, invention told another. By the winter of 1916, Britain was producing 1 tank per day. By the end of the war, that number would rise to 24. In 2 years, over 200 to 500 tanks would roll off British assembly lines, each an echo of that first morning on the Somme. The machine had proven that no defense was permanent, no trench eternal. In the aftermath, generals and engineers alike stood on the fields of flares, measuring craters, studying broken armor, calculating angles of penetration. They spoke in the language of efficiency and steel. But among the wrecks, the ghosts of that first attack lingered, the men who had driven those tanks into history. Their sacrifice was not recorded in tonnage or speed, but in silence. Fact had replaced myth, but both were necessary to understand what the Mark I truly was. It was not perfection, it was transition. The bridge between an old world of horses and bayonets and a new one of engines and oil. And in that bridge, thousands had already been lost. The reports ended with a single quiet line: further development recommended. Beneath those words lay the unspoken truth: the war had changed forever, and there was no going back. Private Thomas Hensley hadn't slept for 2 nights before the assault on flares. The rain had turned the trenches into brown rivers that swallowed boots, rifles, and sanity. He was 23 and already felt 100. His uniform was soaked through his fingers, numb from clutching his Lee Enfield, and his ears still rang from the artillery that never seemed to stop. When the order came down that morning, prepare to advance behind the new machines, he thought it was another cruel joke from command. The men in his section laughed bitterly. Machines, what kind? Flying pigs, someone said. No one answered. No one knew. At 5:30 a.m., the bombardment began again. The sky pulsed with light. The ground shook like it wanted to crawl away, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and soil. Then came the silence, brief, heavy, unnatural. From the fog ahead came a low, metallic growl. Hensley looked up. Out of the smoke rolled something that didn't belong to this world. Its shape was wrong, its motion unnatural, part building, part beast. Riveted steel plates glistened under the pale sun, mud clinging to every edge. It rumbled forward with deliberate certainty, crushing barbed wire like grass, leaving deep gouges where its tracks bit into the earth. The first Mark I tank. It bore the stenciled name HMLS Centipede, painted roughly across its hull. 2 6-pounder guns jutted from its sponsons like the tusks of a prehistoric creature. Steam hissed from its joints. Hensley stood frozen in awe. Around him, British infantrymen stopped cheering and simply stared. "Bloody hell, it's alive," someone whispered. The machine didn't answer. It just kept moving. Inside the tank, Lieutenant Arthur Folk wiped sweat from his eyes, his hands black with grease. 8 men shared the cramped steel box sealed away from daylight and air. The temperature inside had already climbed above 100 degrees. The roar of the 105 horsepower Daimler engine drowned all other sounds. Shouting was useless, they spoke through knocks on the armor. 2 taps meant left, 3 meant right. Every breath carried the taste of fuel and metal. The gunner Sergeant Alan Wren worked the traverse handle of the 6-pounder, his arms trembling from effort. "Enemy trench in 30 yards," the commander shouted, but no one could hear him over the engine's howl. When the tank hit its first crater, it lurched forward violently, throwing the crew against the walls. Rivets popped loose like bullets. One struck the loader's arm. Blood mixed with sweat and oil. They barely noticed. The smell of exhaust was choking them, but the machine didn't care. It growled across the mud, unrelenting. Outside, the German machine guns opened up. The rattle of 7.92mm rounds slammed into the armor, sparking bursts of fire and ringing like a hammer on an anvil. Inside, every impact felt like a kick to the chest. Hensley followed behind in the open part of the wave of infantry that moved when the tanks advanced. He kept his head low, the mud splashing with each step. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of the tank's engine drowned the world. The Germans ahead were shouting. He couldn't understand the words, but the panic in their voices was unmistakable. They fired, reloaded, fired again, and still the tank came on. Its treads climbed the lip of the first trench, groaned, then crushed it flat, burying the men inside. From his narrow vision slit, Fuchs saw the line buckle. He gestured, and Wren fired. The recoil slammed them both backward. The shell burst among the enemy, and for a heartbeat everything was light and noise. "Keep her steady!" Wren yelled. The driver pushed forward, blinded by smoke, the gears screaming. The tank slid sideways into a crater, tilted dangerously, then clawed its way back up. One of the crew vomited from the motion and fumes, but they didn't stop. Their orders were simple: advance, crush, destroy. Outside, Hensley could see the effect spreading down the line. Germans were abandoning their positions, some firing wildly over their shoulders, others simply dropping weapons and running. "They're breaking," someone shouted. For the first time in months, the word advance meant something. The British infantry surged forward behind the Mark I, using it as moving cover. Hensley stumbled over the bodies of men, some German, some British, half buried in the churned mud. The smell of oil and blood filled his lungs. The tank loomed ahead like a moving fortress, indifferent to everything around it. Inside, the chaos never stopped. Wren's gun jammed. The loader tried to clear it with a wrench, his hands slick with sweat. The heat made their heads spin. The engine threatened to stall with every incline. "She's choking," shouted the driver. Folk banged on the wall, signaling to ease the clutch. The tank wheezed, then roared back to life. They hit the second trench line at an angle, grinding over it with a metallic shriek. Bullets pinged off uselessly. But as they reached the far side, a shell landed too close. The explosion lifted the tank's rear and slammed it down, shaking every rivet loose. The right track cracked. The tank lurched, stuttered, and stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the engine sputtering and the faint hiss of escaping steam. "We're bogged," Wren muttered. Folk didn't reply. He looked through the slit and saw the German line collapsing around them, smoke and confusion everywhere. "Then we'll hold here," he said finally. "Make it count." Wren nodded, swung the gun toward a clump of enemy soldiers regrouping beyond the trench, and fired again. The shell tore through them, sending soil and bodies skyward. Outside, Hensley dropped beside the tank, using its hull as cover. He pressed his hand to the armor. It was burning hot. Through the narrow side door, he could see flickers of orange light from the engine compartment. "Are they still in there?" someone shouted. Hensley nodded, though he wasn't sure. The machine was groaning like something alive, its exhaust pipe belching black smoke. Another explosion shook the ground, and he threw himself down. Inside, Folk knew they couldn't move again. The right track was destroyed, and the gearbox was cracked. "Abandon her!" he shouted. The men looked at him in disbelief. Leaving the machine felt like betrayal. It was more than steel. It was every ounce of effort they'd given, every drop of blood already spilled. But orders were orders. They kicked the hatch open and crawled out into the fog. The world outside was unrecognizable: mudfire, broken wire, the smell of flesh and oil. Folk turned back to look at the tank. For a second it seemed to be breathing, steam rising from its vents like sighs. Then another shell hit nearby, and flames began to crawl across its side. The Mark I burned for hours. By dusk, its steel skin glowed red, and its guns drooped like wilted branches. Hensley sat a few yards away, with the survivors too exhausted to move. None of them spoke. When night fell, the battlefield shimmered with firelight reflected on puddles of oil. The tank's outline was still visible, its shape both majestic and monstrous. Wren watched it until dawn, then whispered, "We built a beast to fight beasts, and it became one of us." Days later, when engineers arrived to survey the wrecks, they recorded it simply HMLS Centipede, disabled by shell fire. Crew survived. Nothing about the heat, the terror, the noise, or the smell. Nothing about the way the machine had seemed to come alive under fire. The war had no space for the human heartbeat behind the engine. Months afterward, Hensley would be transferred to another front, another hell. He would carry a small piece of scorched armor in his pocket the size of a coin cut from the side of that first tank. He called it a reminder of the day the future arrived. He'd tell new recruits about the machine that walked through wire and smoke as if the earth had grown tired of men killing each other and decided to help. They would laugh, not believing him, until the next generation of tanks rumbled past, bigger, faster, louder. When he closed his eyes at night, Hensley could still hear the sound, the slow grinding rhythm of steel on mud, the groan of a world changing shape. He wondered whether humanity had invented the machine or whether the machine had invented them. On the Somme in September 1916, it didn't matter. The tank had crawled out of the mud, and nothing living or dead would ever stop its march again. In the weeks that followed, the debut of the Mark I at Flers Courcelette, Europe, trembled with a mixture of disbelief and denial. The Germans, masters of the defensive line, had built an entire doctrine around immovable ground concrete wire geometry. The tank had undone all of it in a morning. Across Berlin, reports poured in from corps commanders enemy deployed armored land ships, infantry unable to resist psychological collapse observed. The High Command dismissed the first accounts as hysteria, but by October, fragments of burned steel from the Somme had reached German laboratories. The evidence was undeniable. Something new had entered the war, something that ignored every rule of engagement. In London, meanwhile, the numbers began to take shape. Out of the 32 tanks that had crossed the Channel, 9 reached enemy lines intact. Only 6 had remained operational by nightfall. And yet, the advance achieved with those 6 was greater than any British gain in the entire Somme campaign. One machine had covered 1,000 yards under fire without losing momentum. Another had crossed a trench 8 feet wide, something no horse, no man, no machine had ever done. For the generals of the British Expeditionary Force, it was not perfection that mattered. It was proof. Proof that the future had weight tracks and the sound of an engine. The German General Staff began drafting emergency countermeasures. Artillery units were instructed to target the base of the armor vehicle rather than its body. Field engineers were ordered to dig deeper, narrower trenches to trap them. New armor-piercing ammunition was rushed into production, but the fear had already taken hold. In letters captured from the front, German soldiers described nightmares of metal beasts that cannot die, giant coffins that move by themselves. A psychological fracture had opened a gap no fortification could fill. At the same time, Britain's own engineers were racing ahead. The War Office authorized immediate development of the Mark II and Mark III models, improving armor and drive systems, fixing the steering failures that had crippled the first wave. The mechanical evolution was breathtaking. Within 3 months, the new prototypes doubled operational range and cut breakdowns in half. In secret factories across Lincoln and Birmingham, women and men worked through the night under blackout curtains, forging a new species of machine. Their production reports read like scripture: engine improved, armor tested to withstand 57mm fire, mobility increased by 18%. But on the field, the transition from disbelief to adaptation was brutal. The Germans realized that for every steel monster that advanced, there were still 100 men who had to follow behind it. Their machine guns adjusted, targeting the infantry once more. The battlefield became a chessboard of steel and flesh, each tank a new piece, each bullet a move in an evolving strategy. Commanders on both sides began to see what was coming. The stalemate of the trenches was ending, but what replaced it was worse movement, mechanized and merciless. The contrast between the old and the new was almost poetic in its cruelty. The cavalry, once the pride of every army, now stood useless beside the railway lines. Horses flinched at the sound of engines bolting, at the smell of fuel. The age of gallantry died in the mud of the Somme. What replaced it was iron smoke and calculation. The tank had stripped war of its illusion of honor. It was no longer man versus man. It was system versus system, machine versus machine. The Germans understood this faster than anyone. Within 6 months, they began developing their own armored designs, A7V prototypes, lumbering giants of steel inspired by the very weapon they had feared. The British records show that by early 1917, production had accelerated beyond control. The factories that once built ships and locomotives now forged hulls and tracks. Each Mark I required 14 tons of steel, 5,000 rivets, and 150 man-hours of labor. The national output of coal and oil had to be restructured to feed the machines. The war had become an industry, and the tank was its engine. In this industrial fever, even the language of reports changed. Commanders no longer spoke of courage or valor. They spoke of efficiency output and mechanical effectiveness. The contrast was everywhere on the battlefield, in the economy, in the imagination. Soldiers who had once been terrified of the tank now began to trust it, even to love it. They called it the mother, the guardian, our moving wall. They painted names on its sides. Creeping Jenny Lusitania's Revenge, Creme de Menthe, as if naming it could humanize it. The British newspapers fed the myth. Headlines screamed, "The machine that walks through fire." Britain's secret weapon breaks the line. The landship turns the tide. The public needed heroes. The tank gave them one. But those who drove it knew the truth. It wasn't a hero. It was hunger. It devoured men, fuel, and earth alike. The numbers were merciless. Each tank consumed 2 gallons of petrol per mile. For every hour in combat, it required 10 hours of maintenance. For every tank lost, 3 had to be cannibalized for parts. And yet, despite its flaws, the weapon had achieved something no bomb or battalion could. It had broken the mind of the enemy. The Germans called it Tankschrecken, the tank terror. Reports from captured soldiers confirmed it. We could not stop it. We fired and it did not die. It moved over us and the world ended. Fact merged with folklore. In British camps, soldiers told stories of tanks climbing over churches, of bullets bouncing like rain, of crews emerging untouched from burning fields. In reality, the crews often came out blind, deaf, half-poisoned by exhaust fumes, their hands burned from touching metal. But myth is stronger than flesh. Myth drives men forward. By the spring of 1917, the British Army had created the Tank Corps, a new breed of soldier to match the new breed of weapon. Their motto, "Through the mud and the blood to the green fields beyond," was carved into every recruit's heart. They trained not for precision, but for endurance, to endure heat, claustrophobia, noise, and terror. The tank became a living organism of war, and its operators the neurons of an evolving beast. The German response escalated accordingly. They designed new trenches shaped in zigzags to trap the tank's long bodies. They placed explosive charges beneath the mud. They developed armor-piercing bullets tipped with tungsten and reinforced their artillery with direct-fire howitzers. Yet every adaptation only confirmed one truth: the war was no longer theirs to control. Technology had seized command. The tank had forced every general, every scientist, every soldier to serve the machine. The rhythm of the war changed. The whistle of cavalry horns faded. The low growl of engines became its heartbeat. Infantry tactics shifted from wave attacks to coordinated armor assaults. Pilots began spotting for tanks from above. Communications officers learned to signal with flags and flares to guide the mechanical giants through the haze. It was no longer a war of human endurance. It was a rehearsal for something greater, colder, more absolute. More. By late 1917, the first mass armored assault was planned, the Battle of Cambrai. 476 tanks would move as one, guided by mathematic precision, rolling thunder made real. The Mark I had become the ancestor of an empire of steel. The Germans prepared with everything they had: new anti-tank guns, new trenches, new terror. But it would not be enough. The escalation was not just in numbers, it was in understanding. For centuries, wars had evolved slowly. But within a single year, from the mud of the Somme to the fields of Cambrai, the entire logic of battle had been rewritten. Mobility, protection, firepower. Those were the new commandments. Infantry would follow machines. Machines would decide the war. The British government's after-action reports from the Somme concluded with words that history would remember. The tank has demonstrated that no fixed defense can withstand continuous mechanical movement. Behind that bureaucratic phrasing lay a prophecy. If the tank could break the trench, it could break the world. The Germans had learned that first. The rest of humanity would learn it soon enough. And so, as autumn 1916 faded into winter, Europe stood at the edge of something it could not yet name. The old war had shattered the one fought by men, mud, and honor. The new one had begun, the war of engines. The Mark I had rolled out of the Somme like a herald of what was coming, its roar echoing through the minds of every soldier who survived. It was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of a new kind of future, one that would never again fit back into the trenches it had destroyed. When the smoke of the Somme finally began to clear, the world understood that something irreversible had happened. The Mark I had not merely crossed a trench, it had crossed a threshold. Generals who once ruled by maps and courage were now forced to think in terms of torque-gear ratios and fuel consumption. The machine had rewritten the grammar of war. In the headquarters at Montreuil, British officers gathered around the first detailed after-action reports. The handwriting trembled with exhaustion. Tanks advanced steadily under heavy fire. Enemy positions broken. Infantry followed successfully. The words were calm, bureaucratic, almost modest. But between those lines was the birth of a new empire, an empire of steel. The initial disbelief faded, replaced by a hunger for more. Letters from the front described how the Mark I had terrified even its own allies. Soldiers following behind could feel the ground shake under its weight. It seemed to drink the earth, to crawl through it, unstoppable. Commanders who had once sworn loyalty to the horse now stood in mud, watching as this mechanical creature rendered their tactics obsolete. Colonel Ernest Swinton, who had once been laughed out of meetings for proposing the idea, now found himself lecturing the War Office about production logistics and maintenance cycles. "Gentlemen," he said, "the tank is not a weapon. It is a revolution." Few realized how right he was. Across the Channel, the reaction in Germany was fury and fascination. Ludendorff's notes from late 1916 admitted that the English armored machine has unsettled our men, but he insisted the shock would pass. It did not. The German army ordered captured fragments to be studied by Krupp engineers, who marveled at the crude simplicity of the design: overlapping plates, exposed rivets, fragile steering. A child's toy, one engineer scoffed until he realized that this toy had broken a front line that 2 million shells had failed to move. The German war machine was built on precision, but the British tank was built on defiance, on the crude power of improvisation. And in war, audacity is often stronger than perfection. The effect on morale was incalculable. In the trenches, British soldiers who had been drowning in futility began to believe again. They told stories that mixed fact and miracle: of tanks climbing over burning trees, of machine gun fire bouncing off like rain, of German soldiers surrendering at the sight of a moving shadow. It wasn't truth, it was something stronger. It was hope. Hope powered by engines and rivets. For the first time in years, the British front sang songs that didn't end in despair. They named the machines like Comrades Centipede Creeping Jenny, HMLS Creme de Menthe. They painted slogans on their sides: through hell and mud, led kindly light to Berlin. The machines were ugly, but they were alive. Inside the tank corps, though, the mood was darker. The men who had driven those first Mark I's came home half deaf, half blind, coughing black soot from their lungs. Many had burns that never healed, fingers twisted from clutching levers that fought back. They knew what the mythmakers in London didn't. The tank was as dangerous to its crew as to its enemy. The vibration could crack bones. Carbon monoxide could kill within minutes. They called themselves the Iron Men in iron coffins. Some never escaped the nightmares, the sound of grinding gears that would wake them in the night. But when new volunteers arrived, eager to drive the next generation of machines, the veterans stayed silent. They knew the future couldn't be stopped. In the factories of Britain, production ramped up like a fever dream. The steel mills of Lincoln and Glasgow poured out armor plates by the ton. Women riveted hulls under the roar of engines, the air thick with sparks and smoke. Newspapers printed heroic sketches of tanks rolling across Europe, crushing tyranny under their tracks. Politicians spoke of the unstoppable British spirit made metal. Yet beneath the propaganda, a quieter realization spread among the engineers. They were no longer building tools. They were building the next stage of evolution. One designer wrote in his diary, "It feels as if we are teaching the earth itself to move." The ripple effect reached beyond the battlefield. Military theorists in France and America took frantic notes, sketching future wars where armored divisions replaced infantry. Imagine hundreds moving together. One French colonel wrote, "A storm of machines rolling in formation." He did not know he was describing the world to come, the blitzkrieg, the mechanized century, the roar of engines that would define the next world war. The Mark I was no longer just a British secret. It was a seed, and its roots were spreading fast. Back on the Somme, the wrecks remained steel carcasses half buried in the mud, their tracks frozen in place like fossils of a future species. When the winter rains came, they filled with water. Soldiers passing by used them as shelters, or as grim reminders of the day the ground came alive. German snipers sometimes used them as cover. British patrols avoided them, saying they were haunted. One corporal swore he heard the faint hum of an engine inside a burned-out shell long after the battle was over. Maybe it was imagination. Or maybe once awakened, the machine never truly slept again. The payoff of invention came with irony. The same weapon that had given Britain its advantage also began to consume it. Logistics collapsed under the strain of fuel and spare parts. For every tank that moved, dozens of horses were still needed to drag petrol drums through the mud. Mechanics replaced officers as the most vital men in the field. The army of empire was turning into an army of engineers. The Industrial Revolution had finally reached the front lines, and no general could halt it. The battlefield had become a factory floor. Meanwhile, the Germans were learning fast. In the spring of 1917, they unveiled their own prototype, the A7V, a towering steel monster armed with cannons and machine guns heavier but slower than the British Mark I. It was cumbersome, clumsy, and mechanically unreliable, but it proved one terrifying point: the idea had spread. The machine age no longer belonged to any nation. Each side was building a mirror of the other, racing toward a future where machines fought machines. The first tank duels would come soon enough in the ruined villages of northern France, where iron met iron under skies black with smoke. By then, the original Mark I crews were ghosts of their own creation. Hensley, the private who had followed behind the Centipede that day, now served as a trainer for recruits. He watched the new models, the Mark IVs, larger, stronger, carrying flamethrowers and mortars, and felt something colder than pride. "We've made the war smarter than us," he said once to a journalist. The reporter laughed, thinking it was a joke. But it wasn't. The soldiers had seen what came next, the moment when human will no longer decided victory, mechanical endurance did. The aftermath of the Mark I's debut rippled through every heart that had witnessed it. In Berlin, generals argued about moral decay. In London, politicians argued about budgets. But on the ground, the men who had fought at flares simply looked at the tracks in the mud and knew the truth. The world had crossed into a different kind of darkness. Where once wars had been fought for kings and borders, now they were fought for progress itself, an idea without mercy. As winter closed in, the Somme quieted, the mud froze, and the burned hulks of tanks gleamed under frost. British photographers captured them for propaganda, heroic silhouettes against sunrise. But those who stood near could see the reality: the smell of oil still sharp in the air, the holes where rivets had torn free, the marks of hands on steel where men had clawed to get out. Victory and horror had become one shape. The generals in Whitehall gathered to analyze results. Charts were drawn, production quotas, set doctrines rewritten. "Mobility is supremacy," one memo declared. Another, more cautious, warned, "In pursuing mechanical strength, we may forget the human cost." It was ignored. History always ignores its own warnings until it's too late. By the time 1917 arrived, the dream had grown teeth. The Battle of Cambrai would see hundreds of tanks moving together in a single assault, guided by precise timing and mathematical coordination. The Mark I's ghost led them all. In every engine's growl, its legacy could be heard, the first heartbeat of mechanized war. What had begun as an experiment at the Somme had become a doctrine. The weapon that once terrified the world now defined it. When the survivors of the 1st Tank Corps marched through London months later, the crowds cheered. Confetti fell like snow. Brass bands played. Children waved paper models of tanks, their laughter echoing through the streets. None of them smelled the oil or heard the screams that still echoed in the ears of the men inside. The Mark I rolled down Whitehall on a flatbed truck, polished and painted, its scars hidden beneath fresh paint. People pointed in wonder. They didn't know they were looking at the beginning of their own century, the century of machines. And somewhere beyond the applause, in the silence between parades, the veterans who had driven that first monster remembered the sound of its gears grinding through the mud, the weight of the air inside, the tremor of the earth when it moved. They understood what few others did, that the war had shifted from men to mechanisms, from will to engineering, from honor to endurance. The payoff of the Mark I was not victory. It was transformation. The aftermath was not peace. It was the realization that humanity had built something it could never fully control. The tank had done what artillery and strategy could not. It had torn open the future, and the future had climbed out, armored and relentless. And as the last survivors of that first crew disappeared into history, the echo of that morning at Flares remained, a metallic roar rolling endlessly through the mud of time, reminding the world that once in 1916, mankind taught the earth to move, and it never stopped again. The war would end, but the echo of that first engine never did. Long after the guns fell silent and the men returned home, the Mark I remained in the collective memory, like a ghost of iron, half legend, half warning. On quiet mornings in 1919, farmers in northern France still found pieces of its tracks buried in their fields, black with rust, glinting faintly beneath the frost. Children played among its carcasses, climbing through broken sponsons that once spat fire. To them, it was a playground to their fathers. It was the sound of evolution, and to the dead, still sleeping beneath the soil, it was the reason they would never come home. In museums and military depots across Britain, a few survivors of that first generation were preserved. They looked small now, fragile even compared to the new giants taking shape in workshops. Yet each dent, each rivet told the story of a world learning to outgrow itself. Visitors would stare at those machines in silence, unable to imagine that once men had sat inside choking on fumes and fear driving toward a line of guns that filled the horizon. The plaques below the exhibits said things like, "First use of the tank in Warfare Flares Courcelette, 1916. But those words couldn't contain the truth. The Mark I wasn't an invention. It was a revelation, and revelations never really end. Private Thomas Hensley went home to Liverpool in 1919 with half-hearing and a chest that wheezed when he laughed. He married, opened a small garage, and refused to speak about the war. Yet on winter nights when the fog rolled in from the river, he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence and listen, just listen for a sound only he could hear. His children thought he was imagining things. He knew better. Somewhere deep in his mind, beneath the scar tissue of memory, the hum of that first tank still lived. He once told his son, when the world learned to move metal like that, it forgot how to stop. His son joined the Royal Tank Regiment 20 years later. Across the Channel, German engineers were doing the same arithmetic. They measured what the British had built not with fear, but with envy. Factories that once produced farm tractors began experimenting with armored hulls. Drawings labeled Sturmpanzerwagen appeared in classified archives. By the early 1930s, a new generation of officers' men who had grown up watching tanks in silent newsreels dreamed of entire armies that moved on tracks. The seed planted at Flares was now a forest. The machine that once crawled through mud at 4 miles per hour had evolved into the beating heart of a mechanized civilization. The irony was brutal. The tank had been born to end the stalemate, to save men from the slaughter of trenches. Instead, it made future wars faster, wider, more relentless. When the next conflict came, the roar of engines replaced the thunder of hooves forever. Entire nations learned the sound of treads on cobblestone, the tremor of cities as armored divisions rolled through their streets. Every mechanical advance was a whisper from that first morning on the Somme, a reminder that progress never asks permission. In letters written years later, Lieutenant Arthur Folk described his memories not as triumph, but as confession. "We thought we were breaking the trenches," he wrote, "but what we broke was the boundary between man and his own creation." He died quietly in 1932, long before the world he feared became real. Sergeant Alan Wren, his old gunner, lived to see those fears take form. During the Second World War, he watched footage of tanks swarming across Europe, hundreds moving together like a metallic tide. "That's the sound," he murmured to his grandson, "the same sound we heard at Flares, but louder." The boy asked if it was victory. Wren just shook his head. On the old battlefield itself, nature tried to reclaim what war had taken. Grass grew over the scars, poppies bloomed again, but beneath every root the steel bones of machines still slept. When the wind blew across the Somme, it carried a low metallic note, like the echo of an engine turning over somewhere far below the surface. Locals swore the ground still vibrated after heavy rain. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps the earth never forgot the day it learned to move. In Britain, the Mark I became a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and industrial will. In Germany, it became a lesson in humility. In the rest of the world, it became a blueprint. America's engineers studied its flaws. France built sleeker versions. Russia envisioned armies made entirely of them. The machine had transcended its purpose. It was no longer a weapon of a single war, but a philosophy of motion. Everything that followed the Blitzkrieg, the desert campaigns, the Cold War arsenals, was born from that first grind of gears in 1916. And yet, for all its influence, the Mark I remained heartbreakingly human. It was clumsy, deafening, vulnerable. Its armor could be pierced, its engine could fail, its crew could suffocate before reaching the line. It was no god, it was a mirror. It reflected the stubbornness of a species that would rather build monsters than surrender. It proved that innovation doesn't bloom from genius alone, but from desperation, from the will to survive when survival seems impossible. The tank was mankind's confession: we could not stop killing each other, so we built something that could do it better. By the 1950s, only a handful of the original tanks remained intact. They sat in museums quiet and immovable. Children climbed onto them during summer fairs, their laughter echoing inside the hollow shells. None of them could imagine the heat, the fumes, the screams that once filled that space. Each visitor left fingerprints on the armor, and in that small gesture the circle closed. Man and machine touching again, no longer in war but in curiosity. The Mark Y had survived its purpose, becoming history's paradox, the first machine to save no one and change everything. Historians still argue about its true impact. Some claim it shortened the war by breaking the German line, others insist it prolonged the slaughter by inspiring new technologies. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies not in strategy, but in symbolism. Before the Mark I, power had faces, kings, generals, empires. After it, power had gears. The age of men ended in 1916, and the age of machines began with a roar in the mud. One photograph remains the kind that history books reprint without context. It shows a Mark I advancing through smoke, its treads half buried, its hull scarred. In the background, soldiers follow cautiously, almost reverently. The image captures a moment of awe the instant humanity realized it was no longer alone on the battlefield. Decades later, when digital engines hum quietly in laboratories and machines think for themselves, that photograph still speaks. It whispers that everything began there in the mud of the Somme, when men built something they could neither outrun nor outlive. At the Imperial War Museum, under dim light, one preserved Mark I still stands. Its armor bears dents where bullets struck and flattened. Visitors walk around it reading the placard, taking photos, unaware that the air itself seems heavier near it. Guides say that if you stand close enough, you can hear a faint creak, the steel contracting, or perhaps the memory of motion. Every generation that looks upon it sees something different: pride, horror, curiosity, destiny. It's not the machine that matters anymore. It's the reflection it casts. Outside the museum, London's traffic hums a symphony of engines, descendants of the first. Cars, buses, motorcycles, all running on the same faith in movement. The city itself breathes in mechanical rhythm. The tank's legacy is everywhere, in the turbines that light homes, in the engines that cross oceans, in the algorithms that guide drones across distant skies. What began as a weapon became the heartbeat of civilization. And still beneath that progress, the question lingers: have we mastered motion, or has motion mastered us? The Somme lies quiet now. The grass hides the scars, but the soil remembers. Every spring, farmers unearth pieces of shrapnel, sometimes a rusted rivet, sometimes the curve of an old tread. They place them on stone walls like relics, unknowing that each fragment is a fragment of the moment the future began. When the wind sweeps across those fields, it carries a low hum, like an echo of something ancient and unfinished. What if the Germans hadn't underestimated that slow, clumsy machine in 1916? What if they had seen not a curiosity, but a prophecy? Would the 20th century have sounded different, less like thunder, more like silence? Or was it inevitable that once the Earth learned to crawl on its own, nothing could stop it from running? Next time, we'll step into that inevitability, into Cambrai, where hundreds of tanks moved together for the first time, and the dream born in the mud of the Somme became an army of iron. But for now, listen to that echo fading across a century, the whisper of tracks over mud, the heartbeat of an idea too powerful to die. The Mark I may rest in museums, but its shadow still moves. And in that shadow, the world still marches forward, chasing the sound of its own creation.